Sometimes I worry that these videos make it sound as though I arrived in games with standards already installed, as though I entered the industry fully formed, inherently aware of my value, somehow above the occasional humiliating compromise. Sadly, no. I too have made undignified professional decisions. Early in my career, I landed 3 serious projects back to back, the sort that make you think, brilliant, I'm in now. You think that the work will continue to arrive like a little conveyor belt of opportunity. And then one day you wake up and there's bugger all. There's no emails, no calls. All you've got is a calendar staring back at you, holding hands with a bank balance that is reminiscent of your teens. When that silence arrives, something starts to shift psychologically. Your standards start to erode. And I say erode because it happens gradually. And then one day you look around and realise that you've put yourself in a position that no sane person ever would. And so today I shall regale you with a tale of when I did precisely that. A few years ago, during a particularly dry spell, I saw a job posting on Discord and I reached out. The person replied saying that they were interested and they outlined a rate. It wasn't an especially good rate. At the time, however, I wasn't exactly drowning in attractive alternatives, so I considered it. The conversation seemed to progress positively enough, and so I was told I'd hear back soon. Then nothing. Days pass. I follow up. Nothing. Follow up again after a couple of weeks. Still nothing. Then, several weeks later, they suddenly reappear. Still interested by all accounts. However, audio was, in their words, just not that important. They were now concerned about the original rate that they themselves had outlined, thus lowering it. After some internal debate, I took it anyway. Supposedly, there would be a contract coming through, ASAP, which is always a comforting phrase because it contains just enough urgency to disguise the absence of an actual date. The contract never arrived, and so more waiting, more silence, more follow-ups from me. Each message placing me gradually more on the back foot, because what I now know is that when you appear needy, you begin compromising your positioning before the professional arrangement has even properly commenced. Eventually, I do hear back, and sure enough, the rate drops again, and I still take it. Yet again, I'm assured the contract is coming, because now there's a vital deadline in about 2 weeks and they desperately need my help. And so I say, all right then, get me the contract and we'll see what we can do. No contract, no work. Another week passes. The contract comes through. Wonderful. Less wonderful, it's accompanied by a list of around 200 assets that now need creating within the 5 days that then remained. To be fair, I had agreed to do the work, and pipelines can become messy, especially in smaller productions. I fully understand that. Game development is full of pressure. We do have to deal with the occasional production spreadsheet that looks like it was assembled at gunpoint. I was never expecting perfect order, nor do I ever. Complications occur in every industry. They're expected, to a point. But what followed went beyond normal production mess. On that project, we were releasing updates every 2 weeks. Only, nobody would provide the required asset lists until the absolute last moment. And so for me, every update became this recurring ritual where I would spend days trying to get clarification, already knowing exactly how the sprint would end. With panic, last-minute requests, sleep deprivation to the point of health endangerment. And then I'd be expected to magic everything together at the 11th hour through nothing more than sheer determination and grit. From their perspective, I imagine it looked as though I was simply working very quickly. In reality, I was working 14+ hour days for what effectively amounted to around £10.50 an hour. And I'll add, this was not a case of dragging stock sounds into a timeline. Many of these were bespoke pieces of audio that could easily take 30 minutes each, even when working at a completely unreasonable pace. And then also I had to write 4 minutes of music for every update. The rate itself was bad enough, but there was a deeper problem, and that was that the pipeline had trained everyone around it to treat chaos as an acceptable modus operandi. There is a point where poor production etiquette stops being an inconvenience and becomes an extraction mechanism. The missing structure has to be recovered somewhere, and in small teams it's often paid for by whoever is most afraid to say no. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that in our story, that poor sod was me. And then came the moment that perfectly crystallized the entire experience. One sprint, another member of the team, accidentally, I suppose, told me what was coming in the next update. So I thought, marvellous, for once I can actually stay ahead of schedule instead of staying up until 4 in the morning trying to salvage another bloody catastrophe. And so I make my contact aware, asking whether he's happy for me to commence work on this batch. I probably don't need to tell you that he never replied. By this point, I understood the pattern perfectly. 5 days before the deadline, an avalanche of work would come crashing down on me, and I would once again be expected to compensate for organizational dysfunction through my own private collapse. And so, armed with my beautiful, nice, shiny list, I made the assets proactively, and I sent them over, feeling rather proud of myself. He replied immediately, and he was fucking livid. I was told, in no uncertain terms, that they would not pay for work they had not explicitly asked me to do, and if I did this again, I would no longer be welcome on the team. I think he may have been having a bad day. But his response, beyond being utterly disproportionate, was fascinating, because the only reason I had made those assets in the first place was that communication had become so unreliable that I no longer trusted the pipeline. At the time, I was dismayed, obviously, but looking back, there's an observation to be made here. The relationship had already degraded before that dispute took place. The process had trained me to anticipate disorder. A functioning production pipeline should allow people to make intelligent decisions and take initiative, but in this case, initiative had become a liability, bordering on heresy by all accounts. Now, amongst all this, my invoices were taking weeks to get paid, payment reminders were ignored entirely, and at one point I was also informed that the second minute of a piece of music would only be paid for if it were dramatically different from the first, because if the second minute sounded remotely similar to the first, that did not constitute additional music composition. Which is one of those statements so extraordinary that a strange sense of peace washes over you. You think, so we've left the realm of commerce and have entered folklore. And still, I stayed in that arrangement longer than I should have. And that's the reason I'm telling you this story. The useful lesson here has very little to do with one unpleasant project, or indeed any unpleasant project. The more important thing is what happens to your internal calibration when you operate from a position of fear. Desperation changes your idea of normal. Late payment, being ignored, these start to feel ordinary. Your rate gets negotiated downward, and instead of recognizing the insult, you start calculating whether you, yourself, are able to absorb it. You stop asking whether something is reasonable, and you start asking how many concessions you are able to make. Once survival becomes your only metric, you become very, very easy to manage badly. And that's why I sometimes laugh when I hear people talk about grinding as though it's inherently noble. Hard work matters. Of course it does. There are deadlines, compromises, there are ugly builds, broken tools. There will be late nights. There will be moments where everyone has to push harder than they would otherwise like to. And to be honest, I quite enjoy that. Most of the time, I'm not precious about effort. The trap, however, is when effort becomes a substitute for respect. If you're frightened enough, the industry will happily teach you to confuse exhaustion with requisite professionalism. The industry will condition you to conflate usefulness with being consumable. The awful thing is that you may even feel proud of it for a while. I did. I thought that all of that was some sort of exhibition of my resilience. And in one sense, it was. I delivered the work, I kept showing up, I solved problems that probably should have been solved much earlier in the chain. But the question I failed to ask was what kind of professional relationship I was helping to cultivate by tolerating all of that nonsense. What was being lost in the process? Standards include money. Of course they do. Anyone who pretends otherwise is usually either very rich or about to ask you for a discount. But they also include the conditions required for you to do good work and the manner in which you are willing to be treated whilst doing it. Professionalism requires tolerance. It always does. Difficult people, confused briefs, late revisions, awkward feedback, shifting priorities, all of that comes with the territory. The barometer is repetition and intent. A messy week can happen. Difficult stakeholders are plentiful, but when the same dysfunction returns repeatedly and everyone involved begins relying on your willingness to absorb it, you're no longer being flexible. You're helping maintain a system that is reliant on you having fewer boundaries than everyone else. If you want good audio, you need more than a person with a library and a DAW. You need time, context, communication, and you need enough stability for judgement to function. Sound is interwoven into every layer of the player experience. It's not decorative seasoning sprinkled over the build 5 minutes before upload, despite the best efforts of certain production people to treat it like paprika. After this company and I stopped working together, I later checked the game page one day out of morbid curiosity, just to see whether they were still updating the game. They were. And those assets I got shouted at for making proactively, they were in the update, which was such a perfect ending to the entire experience that I laughed hysterically when I saw that. What else can you do? I do need to add that I've been very fortunate overall with respect to my collaborators. Many are now dear friends that I feel privileged to be trusted with their vision. Particularly my current collaborator. If you're watching, mate, hello. Like anything in life, you'll meet the occasional prick. We are oft to forget that every client is also auditioning for us. If you're a freelancer watching this, especially early in your career, here is the part that I want you to remember. Your standards rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. Usually, they erode through tiny concessions that feel sensible at the time. You accept the lower rate because the project might lead somewhere. You tolerate late payment because you want to give someone the benefit of the doubt and confrontation may feel expensive. You absorb yet another instance of someone's chaos because you want to seem dependable. One day, you come to realize that the entire arrangement depends on you having no boundary strong enough to inconvenience anyone else. A bad deal does not become strategic because you are suffering through it with a noble expression. Sometimes it really is just a bad deal. The sooner you recognize that, the better your work becomes, because you provide more honest estimates. You communicate without any resentment. Your boundaries stop being invented at the point of collapse. That, I think, is where professionalism begins. Knowing the conditions that allow you to do your best work and having the self-respect to protect those conditions before the whole thing degenerates into a late-night circus with invoices. Stay sharp. I'll see you next time.